Good morning, everyone. My name is Dina Hirsch. I'm a member of the Generations After Board of Directors and serve on our program committee. For the purpose of this program, I'm the coordinator of our Generation After writing groups and a proud member of writing group number 1, the original group that began in the spring of 2018. Gina Roitman, who has been our mentor since we began, will be our moderator today. Born in a displaced persons camp in Passau, Germany, currently living in Canada, Gina is an award-winning writer, biographer, and writing coach. Her works include the short story collection, Tell Me a Story, Tell Me the Truth, the biography Midway to China and Beyond, as well as poetry, essays, and short stories. Her latest work is a literary thriller, the novel Don't Ask. Today's program will feature 4 of our writers: Genie Glucksman, Jane Friedman, Margarete Diener Levy, and Rachel Miller. There is a link to the short bios posted in the chat. Afterwards, there will be a brief Q&A. Please enter any questions you might have into the chat, and we will address as many as we can during the Q&A. Welcome, Gina, and our featured writers.
Good morning, everybody. Some 7 years ago, I had the privilege of being invited to Washington by Generations After. I came to share my documentary, My Mother, the Nazi Midwife, and Me, and to talk about why I was compelled to keep telling my story as a 2G. As an adjunct to the talk, I offered a 2-hour memoir workshop. Some 20 people signed up. The response left me a little overwhelmed, so I asked each person to provide a brief synopsis of their story, thinking that would help to get us started. It did more than that. It opened the floodgates, and that day we heard 20 compelling stories, each different, but always with something familiar. There were threads that passed through each story that most of us could recognize and relate to. From there began the memoir workshops that have over time seen some 22 participants write and share their stories, almost all but 2 of them daughters of Holocaust survivors. I've led the first 2 groups, while Tommy Schnurmacher has led a third. Telling your story, recording it for family and posterity, is a key reason we write. After all, once we're gone, those untold stories die with us. Although the effort to record our stories began slowly, tentatively, the writing has now become easier and much more skilled. I believe that writing is a muscle that grows stronger the more we use it. More importantly, confidence and the trust between us has grown organically as we recognized how we were all struggling to reframe the stories we have carried through our lives. Traditionally, we've been 6 to 9 members per group, and there are now 3 groups. In bi-monthly 2-hour sessions, we review on average 3 stories told from the perspective of how our lives as 2Gs have been shaped by the Shoah. Writing personal essays was a new experience for many, so to make certain that everyone was comfortable, not only in the writing, but also in the important critiquing of each other, I suggested a framework to help ensure that comments were both constructive and positive. We call it the fear cautious, 4 questions. What is the writer's intention, the theme? In what way did the writer accomplish this intention well? What was the one thing or more that glowed in the story? And finally, what improvements could be made to the story to accomplish the intention? This positive approach is now so well ingrained, we no longer rely on the format. The program and the close relationships that have evolved from sharing stories has grown gradually and progressively. Writing opens doors to rooms we have forgotten or sometimes never knew existed. What I learned was this, that no matter what country, income class, or lifestyle we came from, we have been bound by strong common threads to the point that the majority of us now call each other sisters, Schwesters. What has evolved over the years, the power of the stories being told, makes me very proud to be part of this process. In the stories you will hear today, you may agree with me that they have succeeded in giving truth to my favorite quote from C.S. Lewis: "We read to know that we are not alone." That might just as easily be applied to why we two G's write. And now I would like to invite Genie Glucksman to begin.
Good morning. My name is Genie Glucksman, and I'm the eldest daughter of two Holocaust survivors from Poland, Józef Glucksman and Mania Marmor. Both parents survived ghettos, slave labor camps, death marches, and concentration camps between 1940 and 1945. My mother spoke often about her happy youth within her large family, and then as my sisters and I got older, she shared stories of her experiences during the war. My father, the only survivor of his family, rarely spoke about the war. For many years, I've wanted to write my mother's story for posterity, specifically for the benefit of future generations of her descendants, and as a tribute to my mother, my personal hero. But I hesitated, concerned that my academic background hadn't equipped me to write in a more informal narrative style. I was finally galvanized into action a year ago after hearing a panel of Generations After members speak about their experiences in their writing group. Emboldened, I joined an existing writing group and have been writing since then, supported by a nurturing group of writing sisters. My excerpt is from a much longer piece about my mother, Mania's deportation from the Krzanów ghetto in southwest Poland in February 1943. After her parents were deported on October 22, 1942 to Auschwitz-Birkenau, 12 and a half miles from her hometown, 18-year-old Mania was alone in the ghetto, an unprotected orphan. 4 months later, orders arrived from Nazi high command to completely empty the Jewish ghetto of Krzanów, to make it Judenrein, cleansed of Jews. Leaflets with instructions to report to the deportation staging area at a specified date and time were plastered throughout the ghetto. On the day of the roundup, Mania woke up very early to mentally brace herself for the selection and whatever might follow it. Angry clouds moved quickly across a leaden sky, a harbinger of a Polish snowstorm. When she stepped out of her apartment building, pellets of sleet stung those parts of her face that were not covered by her hat and scarf. But Mania didn't feel the cold. Her entire being was focused on how she might realize her goal of reuniting with her beloved older sister, Genka. Besides, she was very warmly dressed. Under her by now too large winter coat, Mania was wearing a heavy dress, multiple sweaters, woolen stockings, and 2 layers of woolen skirts. A second pair of woolen stockings made it extremely difficult to squeeze her tiny feet into her sturdiest shoes. Baby-faced Mania wore all that clothing because she hoped she would look older and more substantial, and because she wanted to free up as much space in the single allotted suitcase for some of her sister's clothes and for other necessities. Scraps of food, family photos, underclothes, spare shoes, and lighter garments in the event this hellish war were still raging in the spring and summer. The suitcase was quite heavy, but Mania was strong and determined. Mania prepared herself before the Aktion in the same studious way she had always prepared for school examinations. She wanted her German to be as perfect as she could possibly make it. She crafted several sentences in anticipation of what she might be asked about her work skills. She practiced saying her sentences over and over out loud in front of the mirror for 2 days. She wanted to make sure she could say them naturally and firmly, without any trace of uncertainty or fear. As she stood on the line waiting to be questioned by an SS officer, Mania could feel her anxiety mounting. Her heart was hammering away in her chest, and she felt cold sweat trickling down her back. To steady her nerves, she began to mentally rehearse the statements she had prepared. She tried to imagine she was about to recite poetry in front of her classmates. When she came to the head of her line, Manya squared her shoulders and straightened her posture in an effort to stretch to her full 4'9" frame. When she was beckoned, she stepped forward with no hesitation and prayed that her flushed face would not betray the fear she felt. The uniformed official looked her up and down appraisingly, noting her sturdy frame, ruddy complexion, and tidy appearance. After presenting her documents, Manya easily answered questions regarding her personal details. The Nazi seemed pleased with her crisp German. Then he questioned her about her occupation. Beruf? Manya looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time in her life, brazenly lied. Ich bin eine geschickte Weberin. I am a skilled weaver. I can set up and run hand and power-operated looms. In that moment, she was afraid she might vomit from the pent-up tension and fear. This brief interaction might have life or death consequences. Fortunately, her answer seemed to do the trick. The officer wrote Weberin next to her name on a list. At that point, Manya volunteered to be sent to Greenberg, the site of a huge factory where her sister was already enslaved. The Nazi didn't respond one way or the other and sent her to the right, where other hardy young people were assembled. As it turned out, Manya was assigned to Greenberg. At least 100 older teenage girls and young women were selected for this particular transport. Manya had taken a calculated risk, declaring herself a weaver, but miraculously it had worked out as she had hoped. Hopefully, now she would be reunited with Genka. Manya traveled to Greenberg standing the entire trip, packed in tightly among the others in the boxcar, on a seemingly endless journey. The train came to a standstill every now and then. Sometimes it didn't move for what seemed like hours to those huddled in the dark. The doors in the windowless boxcar were never opened, and no one had any idea in which direction the train was headed. There were benefits to being packed into the boxcar like sardines. The occupants, pressed so closely together, shared their body warmth. Also, no one toppled when the train stopped abruptly or lurched forward. In fact, after many hours, some weary girls even fell asleep on their feet, standing tightly wedged between the others. Manya was afraid to even lift her leg to scratch an itch, for fear she would have no room to put her foot back down afterward. The passengers could only tell if it was day or night by the slivers of light that penetrated the wagon through chinks in the wooden siding. Periodically, women tried to rearrange their cramped bodies in cooperation with those standing next to them, in order to stretch numb limbs or to edge their way toward the pail in the corner, which had been provided for their toileting. Despite being very tightly packed in, as the waste bucket filled, the girls pressed themselves even closer together, trying to keep their distance from the fetid container. When it was in use, they fixed their eyes anywhere else in the wagon in order to provide a modicum of privacy for the girl using the pail. The young women did not at first travel in silence. There was a steady stream of speculation. Where were they going? What would they find when they arrived? Would living conditions be better than what they had lately experienced in the crowded ghetto? What had become of their precious loved ones from whom they had been forcibly separated? Eventually, the effects of uncertainty, fear, and fatigue took their toll. The girls began to retreat into their own thoughts, and their conversations petered out. Manya, too, was silent as she thought about their murky future. In the darkness of the boxcar transporting her to her destiny, the words of a poem by Poland's Shakespeare, Adam Mickiewicz, came to life for Manya, and she recited his words to herself. Darkness and silence everywhere. What will be? What will be?
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I would just like to add something personal here. My mother also was from China, but she left as soon as the war broke out. So it's only through Jeannie's stories that I have in my imagination what happened to my aunts that I never knew. So thank you, Jeannie. Next, we're going to hear a very different story from Gina Friedman.
Hi, I'm Jane Friedman. I joined the writers group fairly late and at first wrote most about my career in journalism. Then when I felt comfortable with my writing sisters, I began to open up and write about my sad family background. This that I'm going to read is part of an essay I wrote about my grandmother. Growing up on Long Island, my trips to New York to visit my grandmother were a delight. Grandma was my father's mom, a Friedman. She escaped German-occupied Belgium in May 1940, arriving in New York months later by the skin of her teeth. She settled on Central Park West in Manhattan, which back in the day was a dicey place, unlike today. After the war, Grandma imploded. She spent most of her life in a dark, rent-controlled apartment, dressed in a pink satin nightgown. She got her news of the outside world from the New York Post page 6 gossip column. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and was overweight. Much later in life, I would joke to myself that an ancestor must have been impregnated by a Pole. Otherwise, how could she be so blonde? Grandma knew the way to my heart. As I was recovering from a tonsillectomy at age 4, she brought me marzipan pieces shaped like fruits. Grandma had me at bonjour. To visit her, starting at age 11, I'd take the Long Island Railroad from Rockville Center, where we lived, into Penn Station, and then the subway to Central Park West. I traveled to Grandma so many times that Central Park West was my idea of New York City. I'd arrive at her building and ring the doorbell at 7F, and Grandma would open the door in that satin nightgown. She shared the apartment with Marcel, her youngest son. He had left the family's diamond business and became a professional bridge player. Marcel was brilliant at bridge, but his only income came from people who hired him to be their partner at tournaments. They were obviously poor. Aside from the plastic-covered couch in the living room and the antique clock on the mantelpiece, the apartment was bare. The casement windows were dirty. The missing person was my grandfather, Joseph Friedman. He had been a diamond merchant in Antwerp before the war, like most of the men in my family. All I knew was that he died a few months before I was born. Grandma never mentioned him. I wish I had brought up the subject, but I had learned to keep my mouth shut. Many years later, after both my parents died and my beloved grandma was also gone, I met with Uncle Marcel at his bridge club. I was desperate for information about relatives whose names I knew but little else. I wanted to have a family history. My parents had never talked about the war or their lives before it. Marcel described the Friedmans' escape from Antwerp, starting with the German invasion on May 10, 1940. Marcel was 16 then, the only son still living at home. My father, Willem, was in the Belgian army and within weeks became a prisoner of war. Dad's older brother, Sylvain, was learning the diamond trade in New York. The escape from Nazi-controlled Europe was scary. They rushed to flee Belgium because the French would close the border from time to time. Once in Dunkirk, English soldiers sold my grandfather gasoline for his car and siphoned it off from their tanks, which they no longer needed. Eventually, there was Paris, and when the Nazis dropped their bombs, the Friedmans ran again, and eventually landed in Bordeaux near the Spanish border. I don't know if you've ever known marriages like my parents, Marcel said, but my father took care of everything. On the escape, Grandma didn't lift a finger except to write a list of all that they had left behind. A Flemish dining room, 4 chairs, a grand buffet, and a piano, sets of china, a tea service, and crystal. She intended to recover it all, a dream. Once in Bordeaux, my grandfather ran to the Spanish and Portuguese consulates for visas, and then to Perpignan for the French exit visa. Without that one, there was no exit from Nazi-controlled France. On June 23rd, they crossed the footbridge into Spain. My grandfather bought food for the lockdown train to Portugal. He bought Toblerone chocolate, baguettes, saucisson, and red wine. That must have been his idea of meals. In Portugal, my grandfather begged the American consul for visas, including for my father, Willem, who had pulled off a daring escape from Belgium. The irony, my grandfather, who had worked tirelessly, was the only one denied a US visa. He had been born in Poland, and the Polish quota was full. My grandma, Marcel, and my father sailed to New York in October. My grandfather sailed alone to Brazil. A year later, he somehow turned up in Trinidad, where he got a US visa and sailed to New York City. I know him only from photographs. In one photo, he's lying flat on a couch. He must have been exhausted. And so was Grandma. She lived in that satin nightgown, only going out when Marcel took her to a French restaurant or when I came to visit. Sometimes when I'd arrive at her apartment, Grandma would bathe in the pink bathroom off her bedroom. She'd emerge in a dark suit with matching pocketbook and a black velvet hat, held in place with a stick pin. I still have that hat and the pin. I treasure them. One time, Grandma took me to the Ice Capades, a circus-type show with clowns and jugglers dancing on the ice. There were trips to Rumpelmeyer's, the fancy tea room, for chocolate eclairs. Yum. But Grandma had mostly given up her pre-war bourgeois life for an inside existence. She was famous for ordering in Chinese food, which Marcel forbade because it drove up her blood pressure. She was a big fan of professional wrestlers on TV, like Gorgeous George and much later Hulk Hogan, and she relished how these beasts hurled each other through the air, landing them on the ropes. Uncle Marcel and I made fun of this, but Grandma binged on the stuff. Grandma also insisted on giving me her gold and diamond jewelry, pre-war relics, and she got pleasure from seeing me wear some of it. On my annual trips to New York when I was living overseas, I always saw Grandma. In 1983, I arrived to learn she was in a coma at Doctor's Hospital. She was almost 93. I sat with her every day, hoping she would open her eyes. No. One day she stopped breathing. I screamed and I wailed. But afterwards, I felt it was right that I was the one who was with her when she died. I was the one who loved her the most.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jane. Powerful stories. Every life is a story worth telling. Marguerite, would you like to take the next step?
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, my friends, my families, and especially my sisters and Gina. My name is Margarete Diener Levy, and I've been a charter member of the writing group from the very first day. I'm also a lifetime member of Generations After, which is a second generation group, even though technically I'm not actually a second generation. I'm a straddler between the first and second generation. I was born on the border of Russia and Siberia, but no one else in my immediate family was from the same area. Mama was from Kiev, Ukraine. Daddy was from Visegrad, Poland. And my younger brother was born in Germany in a displaced persons camp. I don't know the rest of the family. All I knew was our small United Nations little insular family. And one of the things that has hurt me so much is not even knowing the names of my parents' siblings and the many, many relatives that I've lost. Because of that, I treasure every little memory that my parents shared with me and that I recall. They are precious to me. And I feel as though I have a mission, especially now that I have many more years behind me than I have in front of me. And it feels as though all of these stories, which I have become the keeper of, are unborn children inside of me that I need to let out into the world. And that's the reason that I joined the writing group. And I stayed with it, not only because of our wonderful mentor, Gina, but also because one of the things when I write, and I think any person who writes, is that the hardest part is not always thinking of what you're going to write, but the chore is always rewriting. And this is where the wonder of our writing sisterhood is, because each person with their own perspective provides me with a kaleidoscope view, so that when I hear someone else's perspective on what I've written, it makes me think of the new picture in my writing kaleidoscope. And therefore, I've been able to do rewriting. The other very valuable thing is that Gina sometimes gives us a writing prompt. And the part of the story I'm going to share with you started as a writing prompt for a first memory. I did end up rewriting it though, Gina. First memory, a mountain. I wake up with a shiver. I'm on a mountaintop. In a month, I'll be 3 years old, a big girl. But I still want to be held, to be warm, to be with Mama. My eyes open to see no Mama, but near me is Daddy. He's still sleeping. We're alone on a mountain in Bavaria. The sky lightening up awakened me. Also the early morning chill and the birds waking up with their morning songs. I wish I could whistle like them. There's a cool mist everywhere, even though it's the beginning of May. We're high in the mountains, our mountains surrounded by many more, and I see layers and layers of them around us. All the trees on them start out looking dark and gray, and then as the sun rises, everything changes color. Clouds of foggy mist rise up higher like a curtain opening, and all the greens become more visible. There's so many different greens that it looks like a rainbow made of nothing else but the many, many greens. Baby yellow greens, bitter mustard greens, pure, clear, sparkling greens, and deep, mysterious, bluish greens. All those tall green trees have trains of little flowers at their base. I especially love the little daisies and their little sisters, the marguerites, miniatures of the daisies. I love them because Mama named me after them. I am a Marguerite. Mama told me I was born looking like them. Excuse me. I get verklempt when I talk about Mama. My arms were spread out like the little white flower petals. And in my center, I'm still verklempt, sorry. Some, and in my center, my face was smiling. Mama said it was like the golden center of the flower. Sometimes she'd say it was a golden heart in my center. Every time Mama said it, I felt the warmth in my own heart, my center. But today I'm without Mama and I'm sick. That's why Daddy took me to the mountain. I can't be near Mama right now. We're going to have a baby any minute, and we have to keep Mama and baby safe from me. I'm awake all the way now, and the sun feels good to me. Also, Tata wakes up and puts his arms around me. I feel better now, safe in Tata's arms. And he asked me if I'm hungry. I'm hungry a lot. Most recently, we've been living in a displaced persons camp run by the U.S. Army in Traunstein, Germany. It's not our first DP camp, but at least we've been able to get some food here. I still remember being without food before, being hungry from forever, from always hungry, always an empty, hurting, twisting tummy. Today, Daddy surprises me. He finds some tiny eggs in a birdie's nest and feeds them to me. I swallow them raw. He says I must eat so I can get well faster and meet our new baby. Later in life, when we were able to have regular eggs, he used to try making me drink something called guggle muggle, made of raw eggs. But I was never able to get that down again. Meanwhile, on the mountain, I obeyed and had the raw eggs so I could get better. I didn't really understand what faster meant, but I'm a good girl, and I do as I'm told. I swallow the eggs, but I notice that there's only enough for me. Daddy didn't get any.
Beautiful story. Thank you so much.
That's half of it.
We'll have to do this again so you could do the other half. Up next and last, best for last, is Rachel.
Not comfortable being last after those amazing stories. But good morning, and I'm Rachel Miller. I was born in Mittenwald, Germany in 1948 to Jewish Polish newlyweds who met after the ghettos and the camps and the death marches. My grown children often ask me questions that I can't answer. And my daughter reminds me to write what I do know about my family's story of survival, because she says, Mom, when you're gone, there won't be any way to know even little bits of our family's story. She's telling me she wants to know, and I'm trying to pay attention to have the courage to tell the truth about growing up with my very complicated family. I don't think I could have done this without what I think of as the blessing of my 2G sisters. These kind 2Gs, they provide me with space and encouragement to take on what I find so really hard to write about. This story, The Keeper of Little Bits, which I'm going to read from, is one of the last pieces I've written. It's very different than the previous writings, I think. Only after our years of writing was I able to reflect back in this more personal way. I'll read from the beginning and from the ending, so you won't get to hear many of the little bits, but I hope it gives you a sense of my journey with our writing group. So, keeper of little bits. If eyes are a window into the soul, how do I understand my mother? She looked like everyone else's mom, if just a little bit prettier than many. But her eyes, the parts inside the almond-shaped openings, were a lifeless, light blue surrounding pupils that never seemed to expand. Her eyes didn't react, didn't show horror or happiness, even when her lips were tilted up and laughter tumbled from her mouth. Even when she was furious with my father or disappointed with life, her eyes were as still as glass. They were like Mona Lisa eyes that reflected whatever you wanted. Was that a trick she learned from hiding from the Nazis or working in the camps? Were her eyes keeping her identity secret, or her fury with the Nazis hidden? Was she keeping the flood of feelings locked tightly away? Whatever the reason, I became the keeper of the little bits, like puzzle pieces that I learned fit only on the background of the Holocaust. Each piece to the puzzle of my mother arrived, snowflakes dropped into conversations, like the way she told me the bleeding skin on her hands was caused by the caustic soap she was forced to use in the camp. Once I asked why the people elected Hitler. Her answer was thoughtful and cogent. People were very poor and believed he would fix their economy. At maybe 5, I definitely didn't know what an economy was, but there she was sharing this with me as if I were a grown-up. I believe my mother planned to tell me more about what happened to her, but she stopped herself. I could feel it happen when I was maybe 4 years old. It was time for me to go to sleep. But I was afraid of the big bad wolf who had eaten Grandma in the story our teacher read to us. I could imagine the woods. They were just like Mittenwald, the middle of the Bavarian forest where I had come from just a year or two earlier. Somehow our bedtime talk turned to her family. She told me about her mother, who was surprised to have her years after she stopped bearing children. She spoke about her brothers and sisters, about her dog Spitz, about her father who loved her so much that her mother was often angry at him. I asked, "Why was your mother angry?" She said, "I think she just didn't want more children. Maybe she was jealous of all the attention my father gave me." She was reflecting back in time, remembering all the things he had done with and for her. And that time her eyes were alive. Her eyes and her lips were smiling as she thought to answer my questions. I was thinking about this warm, handsome grandfather I wished I knew, wished would care about me the way he cared about her. What happened to Grandpa? Her eyes were looking back in time again. The bright blue seemed to go out of them as she said, "A neighbor told me that he died on the train." His heart stopped. And then she stopped talking. She turned around to close the blinds. I had received the message that talking about her family hurt. We never spoke again in that open way of her love for her lost family. I never got to ask what happened to her mother and siblings. If not for the way she drew down the curtain of her memories, I probably would not remember that conversation. But I hung on to it as if it were a treasure of family. Yet I understand why she couldn't go on with me asking questions. What more could she tell her little girl before the story of her family became far more frightening than Little Red Riding Hood? At 45, my mother had surgery for colon cancer. The doctors said they had gotten it all, but after 6 months, she was saying something was wrong. She could feel it. When her belief was confirmed at the 1-year check, the doctors didn't tell her that cancer had indeed returned. That was the way things were back then. No reason to tell someone the bad news. But she was way too smart not to know. As I was hanging up the phone at the end of our conversation about all her tests, I said a simple, "I love you." This was not our way in my family. Immediately she responded, "Are you saying the cancer is back?" I avoided answering, which I guess was an answer. That is when she told me, "Hitler didn't get me. This cancer won't either." And there it was, her hidden Holocaust just under the surface. I never saw my mother cry, though she had lost so much. Her childhood had been a good one until the war. She was beloved by her father, sisters, and brothers, and probably her mother too. Her papers say she was from Bielsko, Poland. There is one photo, only one, of her standing, a teenager in a bathing suit, leaning toward the hedges that surrounded the side of a tall stucco house. The house she described as having a top floor reserved for the people who baked, cooked, and cleaned. But my mother did cry. She told me that when I married and left home, she cried every time she walked past my room. I never asked her why she was crying. Possibly she would have told me she was crying for all her losses. But I'll never know because I had learned from early on not to ask questions. I am left with the little bits I collected and placed so carefully to make a picture of her life. Each and every piece stands atop the ghettos, camps, and killings of the Holocaust. And I must say, I could never have written that at the beginning. And I really so appreciate the support I've had on this writing journey. And thank you to 2G for making this possible. And of course, thank you, Gina.
Thank you all. You can, I hope, have a small indication of why I'm so proud to be involved with this group and with these women who have been the courage to tell the truth about their lives and the stories that have shaped them. So I hand it back to Shelley.
Yes, this is Shelley Klein. I'm president of the Generations After. Wow, I have to bring myself back to the present. The stories were absolutely wonderful. Thank you all so much. And Gina, thank you for moderating and for leading these groups. I mean, it's just outstanding. Okay, I'm going to handle the Q&A. There are many compliments in the Q&A if the readers would like to go through the chat. Just a couple of questions though. There's one question that's specifically for Marguerite. The question is, which displaced persons camp did your brother go to?
My brother was born in the displaced persons camp in I'm going blank right where he was born. I mean,
Was it in Germany or Austria?
yeah, it was
Stein.
oh, I've just gone totally blank.
Traunstein.
Traunstein, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's old age.
That could be, is that, I saw something in the chat, greetings from your nephew, Jeff. Is that who that was?
Hello.
Guess so.
That's my nephew, Jeff.
Okay.
I share my stories with my nieces and nephews.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. Here's another question. And this is for any of you who would like to respond. Have family, well, you just maybe have answered this a little bit, Marguerite, but have family members read your stories? And if so, how did they react? So I don't know if anybody would like to respond to that.
Can I add something?
Sure.
My younger brother, I used to call him my little brother, but he hates that. My younger brother will often get back to me because I send him everything I write. And he says, "Where did you grow up? Were we living in the same family?"
Mm.
We have very distinctly different perspectives on almost everything I remember. I keep telling him it's because he was so little and so young, he doesn't remember enough.
Well, the age certainly makes a difference, doesn't it? Does anybody else, would anybody else like to share that? Rachel, is that?
Yeah, I sent my Aunt Goldie's story to her sons, and they were rather shaken by it and said, well, they didn't remember it that way. Although I had taken a lot of a lot of the story was straight from her. Things she told me. And it was upsetting for them. But they did say, I could tell how much you loved my mother. That was important to them, that they got that piece of my aunt's role in my life and how much we cared about her. So that was, after that, I stopped sending family anything. It's like, okay. It's really difficult for family to, the process of writing for me has been really discovery. You have all this information and it's in different places and in your mind and maybe on your bookshelves, and you start to pull it all together. And it's not the fantasy that we might have had. And I try really hard to only write what I know is true. And that's not always like fun to hear about. The pain that my aunt went through, living in a broom closet, and hiding. All of it was, they could hide from it all these years, but seeing what happened to her, and it's just too hard. We in writing, we're getting it slowly. We're bringing it all together slowly. When we give it to our family, and if it's about their parents, I'm not sending my cousin Marshall the story about his kind of lecherous father,
Yeah.
you know. um it's just too hard for families to, but it needs to be my story. It's my story, that's it. So yeah, I hope that maybe my kids will read it when they're 80 years old and ready for it.
Thank you, Rachel. Jane or Jeannie, did you want to respond? You're not obliged, but just wanted to give you the opportunity. Jeannie.
I have shared some of my writings with my sisters, but I speak to them frequently as a touchstone, just to make sure that my memories and the stories that I'm working on jive with their memories. And I have to say that writing has given me the excuse to dive deeply into a lot of rabbit holes. I do a lot of research that's not reflected in the writing, but in order to authenticate little details that my mother gave me, such as the color of the stripes on the woolen textiles that they were weaving for German army use. She told me they were red and blue stripes on a gray background. When I found a picture in the Bundesarchiv of fabric, um, like a little light went off, and so I've been having these little light bulbs going off as I find verification for details in my mother's story. It's not necessary, and I do trust my mother's telling, but I've been able to explore all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't normally have um, dug into.
Jane, did you want to or not? Or should I move
Yeah,
on?
I think it's been hard for my kids to identify with these stories, except for my son. I have two kids. They're not kids, they're adults now. My son was very, very close with my father, so his grandfather was still living. And the two of them were very bonded. They loved each other very much. And I think that because of that, my son has really identified with my father's story of, being a prisoner of war and escaping and his whole, long escape from Belgium in 1940. My daughter is just beginning. I did a whole research on my family that of German Jews who were, two of them were killed in the Holocaust and two others survived in hiding. And I did Stumbling Stones in June in Germany. And my daughter really identified with that. And she was sad at the end that she hadn't come along with me. So I think it's been a process for my kids, just as this has been a process for me, because I didn't know very much about my family until the pandemic, when I did a whole big research on what happened to my family. So it's been a process.
Jane, there's a question in the chat. What are stumbling stones?
Mhm.
Stumbling stones are these cement blocks that are embedded into the ground in the last place that one's relatives lived freely during the German occupation. And they have a brass top to them, which says who they were and what happened to them during the Holocaust. And I did this, I applied for these in 2022, but my turn just came up in 2024. And I traveled to Germany for the ceremony for embedding these stones in front of their last freely chosen place in Frankfurt. More than 100,000 of these stones have been planted now by people like myself and other 2G members who want to memorialize their relatives.
Thank
Did that explain it?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Jane. There's another question. And again, this is a general question. I don't know, maybe Gina, you'd like to respond to this. The question is whether there are plans to share the full versions of these stories more widely. The person suggests a video of each author reading them in a YouTube video and doing a short podcast series with each episode being a reading of the story by the author. So
I love that idea.
I think it's great.
Yeah, we had put together the stories several years ago, and we since have a much richer trove of stories. Hoping to get a publisher to produce an anthology of these stories. And life gets in the way of our best intentions, and we had a publisher and then he backed out, and now it's just a question of time and energy and effort. But I think a podcast and videos of this
That would be great, right?
sounds like a lot less work than what we were planning.
Well,
So,
and maybe more 21st century even.
Definitely. I think a podcast, people reading these stories. I mean, just to go back to sharing with the family. I had a younger brother, 3.5 years younger than myself, who sadly passed away over a year ago. He, when I sent him my stories, his question was, "Are you ever going to write about anything else?" And I have written about other things, but first I had to write about this because these stories needed to be told. And so I think perhaps a podcast would be an ideal way to share the stories and going back to something we were talking about before we opened to the public is that we have normal lives, but everything has been affected by where we came from and the stories that we carry with us. And the more we share it, the more inclusive we are. And I think that would be a very positive way to combat the anti-Semitism that, has resurfaced. It's never gone away, but it's resurfaced viciously in the last couple of years.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you all so much again for your stories, and thank you for the participants for being here. But I'm going to actually turn this over now to Dina, back to Dina to officially close the program.
Thank you, Shelley. And wow, thank you to Gina and our writers. Thank you to those of you who asked questions. That certainly added to the value of the program. Thank you also to the program committee and to Ephraim Katsir, who's our technical consultant. If any members of the audience are interested in learning more about and possibly joining our writing group, please email jenactor@jenactordc.org. Also, if you're interested in information about our Speakers Bureau, and a number of our writing group members are also members of the Speakers Bureau, please write that to that same email address. There's a link in the chat to a short program survey, which we would greatly appreciate your completing and returning to us. Your feedback helps us to improve our programming. You will also receive a link to the survey as well as to the recording, which we will post on, the recording will be posted on YouTube. We are currently in our fall membership campaign, and we urge you to log on to our new website and either renew your membership or become members. Since this is the last program before the Fall Chagim, we would like to wish you a reflective, meaningful, and restorative holiday season. May the new year bring peace in Israel and the return of the hostages. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.